Outlaws had left Emmett Cross for dead in the wash below Antelope Ridge, and it was Delia Marsh who found him, though God knew she owed the man nothing but the memory of an old cruelty. She had gone out at first light to gather chokecherries along the dry bed near her cabin. A half-mile from the Rincon Road, when she saw the buzzards circling low and followed the sight of them the way a healer's habit made her follow any sign of suffering, even suffering she might have every right to walk past. She found him crumpled against a boulder, where the outlaws had rolled him after taking his horse, his payroll satchel, and very nearly his life, a bullet wound gone black and swollen in his shoulder, his face beaten past easy recognition. It was only the ring on his hand, the same silver band she had once watched him wear when he courted her 7 years past, that told her exactly whose life lay bleeding out in the dust before her. She stood over him a long moment, her basket of chokecherries forgotten at her feet, and felt the old shame rise in her throat like bile. 7 years ago, Emmett Cross had courted her through an entire spring and summer, walking her home from church suppers, bringing her wildflowers picked along the very creek where she now stood, speaking to her father of futures neither of them had any right yet to promise. And then, 3 days before he was meant to ask her father formally for her hand, his own father had arrived from the county seat with a banker's daughter from Cheyenne on his arm, and an ultimatum in his mouth, and Emmett, young, weak-willed, unwilling to lose his inheritance for a laundress's daughter with no dowry to speak of, had broken it off in the middle of the church social, in front of the whole gathered town, with words so careless and so cruel that Delia had not been able to hold her head up in Rincon for the better part of a year afterward. Delia Marsh isn't the sort of woman a man builds a future on, he had said, loud enough that half the yard heard it, not knowing or not caring that she stood close enough to hear it too. She's fine for a season's amusement, nothing more. She had never fully recovered her standing in the town after that, nor the standing of her widowed mother, whose laundry business had quietly lost half its custom once the wealthier families of Rincon decided a scandal-touched household wasn't fit to handle their fine linens. Delia had learned healing from her mother in the years since herbs and poultices, the setting of bones, the reading of fevers, because a woman disgraced needed some trade the town could not take from her out of spite, and healing, unlike reputation, could not be gossiped away. Now the very man who had ruined her standing with a handful of careless words lay dying in the dirt before her, and no one on God's earth would have blamed her for leaving him to the buzzards. She thought for one long, unforgivable moment of simply walking away, of leaving him for the buzzards and the county to find, of letting the man who had ruined her name in front of half of Rincon lie in the dirt he'd left her reputation in 7 years past. No jury of God or man would have condemned her for it. But her mother's voice rose up in her memory then. The same patient instruction she had given 100 times over a sickbed. A healer doesn't ask what a soul deserves, Delia, only what a soul needs, and Delia found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she could not make her feet carry her away from him after all. She knelt beside him instead. "You don't deserve this kindness, Emmett Cross," she said aloud, to a man too far gone in his fever to hear her, as she tore a strip from her petticoat to bind the worst of the shoulder wound. "But I didn't become a healer to only save the men who've earned it." Getting him back to her cabin took the better part of the morning, half dragging, half coaxing his weight onto the old mule she kept for hauling wood, and by the time she had him laid out on her own narrow bed, sweat-soaked and muttering nonsense in a fever that climbed hour by hour, she had already resigned herself to a long and thankless vigil. The fever held him 3 days. Delia packed the wound with yarrow and changed the dressing by lamplight, spooned willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and sat up long past midnight, more nights than she could count, listening to him mutter half-sentences into the dark, his father's name, the herd he'd lost, and once, 3 times her own name, spoken with a tenderness that unsettled her far more than his silence would have. "Delia," he rasped, on the 3rd night, his eyes finally opening clear for the first time since she'd found him. "Where? How?" "You're at my cabin, near the Rincon Road," she said, keeping her voice flat and businesslike, refusing to let the old ache show. "Outlaws left you for dead in the wash. I found you and brought you here. You've had a fever 3 days from the shoulder wound, but it's broken now, and you'll mend if you rest." He stared at her a long moment, comprehension moving slow and painful across his battered face. "You," he said, "you saved me. I'm a healer, Delia said. I'd have saved any man I found in that condition. Would you have? Emmett said quietly, after what I did to you? She did not answer that, only rose and went to check the dressing on his shoulder with hands that had gone suddenly less steady than she liked. And he had the grace, at least, not to press her further that night. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Delia rose before dawn to tend her small garden and gather what herbs the season allowed, then spent the middle hours changing his dressing, forcing broth and willow tea past his stubborn refusals, and reading aloud from the one worn book of poetry she owned when the fever made him too restless for silence. She told herself at first that she performed each task purely out of a healer's discipline, the same care she would have shown any stranger brought low by violence. But she noticed, by the second week, that she had begun choosing which poems to read based on which ones eased the tight line of pain from his brow, and she did not examine too closely what that particular attentiveness might mean. He asked her once, half delirious still, why she troubled herself so with a man who'd never once deserved her trouble, and Delia had answered before she could stop herself that trouble was easier to give than to explain, and left it at that. He was 3 weeks mending. And in that time Delia learned things about Emmett Cross she had never known in the whole giddy spring of their courtship 7 years past, that his father had died 2 winters back, the estate and its debts falling to Emmett whole. That the banker's daughter from Cheyenne had married elsewhere within the year, the arrangement having been his father's ambition rather than his own, that he had spent every season since running the ranch alone, unmarried, carrying a guilt he had never once found the courage to bring to her door and confess. I've wanted to apologize to you for 7 years, he told her one evening, sitting up now, strong enough to hold his own cup of broth, though his shoulders still ached with every movement. I told myself 100 times I'd ride out to your mother's place and say it plain. I never once had the nerve. It was easier to let the shame sit than to face what I'd see in your eyes if I tried to make it right. What do you imagine you'd have seen? Delia asked, not looking up from her mending. Contempt, he said, which I'd have deserved every bit of. I was a coward, Delia. I chose my father's money over the finest woman I ever courted, and I dressed my cowardice up as good sense, and I said cruel things in front of half the county to make the choosing easier on myself. I've regretted it every day since, and I never once had the decency to tell you so until you'd already saved my life without owing me a moment of it. Delia set down her mending and looked at him fully then, 7 years of careful, guarded distance suddenly harder to hold than she expected. I built a whole life on the other side of that cruelty, she said. I learned a trade because no one in Rincon would trust me with anything softer. I stopped waiting for apologies a long while back, Emmett Cross, because waiting only kept the wound open. I don't know what you want me to say to you now. I don't want you to say anything, he said. I only wanted you to know the truth of it, finally, whatever you choose to do with it. I've carried the lie of my own good sense long enough. You deserve better than my silence, even 7 years late. She did not forgive him that night, not aloud, not fully, but something in the careful weeks that followed, his patience with her guardedness, the honest labor he insisted on doing around her small homestead the moment his strength allowed, splitting wood one-handed, mending her sagging porch rail. Never once presuming on the debt he owed her, began slowly to soften the old scar tissue around her heart. He asked after her mother, long since passed with genuine grief in his face. He asked after her healing work with real curiosity, not condescension, and sat with her some evenings while she ground herbs, asking questions until he understood the properties of half her cabinet. You've built something remarkable out of what I broke, he told her one night, watching her label a jar of dried yarrow by lamplight. I don't say that to excuse myself. I say it because it's true, and because I think I fell in love with you all over again somewhere in these 3 weeks, watching you be exactly the woman I was too much of a coward to deserve 7 years back. Don't, Delia said, though her voice had lost most of its edge. Don't say things like that to a woman who spent 7 years learning not to trust a cross man's promises. Then I'll earn the trust instead of asking for it, Emmett said, however long that takes. It was not given the chance to take very long at all. The outlaws who had left him for dead came back for him on a moonless night 11 days later, having learned somewhere along the county grapevine that the rancher they'd robbed and shot had somehow survived. And that survival meant a witness who could name every one of them to the marshal in Rincon. Delia heard the horses first, 3 sets by the sound of it, coming up slow and careful along the creek bed the way men move when they mean to arrive unannounced. She had learned, in 6 years alone on that range, to trust the particular silence of trouble before she ever trusted her eyes, and every instinct in her body came instantly, coldly awake. Emmett was still too weak to hold a rifle steady with his wounded shoulder. His strength returned enough to walk and work, but not enough for a standoff against 3 armed men, and there was no one within 5 miles to send for help before the trouble reached her door. "Get down, away from the window," Emmett whispered, already trying to rise from the chair by the fire, his face gone pale with the effort. "Delia, I won't have you hurt on my account, not again." "You're in no condition to hold a rifle steady, Emmett Cross, and I won't stand by while you bleed out a second time trying to prove something to me," Delia said, already moving, already thinking faster and clearer than the fear in her chest had any right to allow. "I've lived alone on this range 6 years. I know this cabin and this ground better than 3 strangers riding blind in the dark ever will." She doused the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, and pressed the loaded rifle her father had left her into Emmett's good hand regardless of his protests, then took up her mother's old shotgun herself and moved to the back window, the one that looked out over Woodpile and the well. The one she knew from years of hauling water in every season exactly how to navigate blind. "When they come to door, they'll expect a sick man and a frightened woman," she said, low and steady. "They won't expect me circling round from the well with a shotgun loaded for wolves. Hold the front, Emmett. Don't let them pass the threshold. I'll take them from behind before they've time to think twice. Delia, I didn't save your life to lose you the same men twice," she said, and slipped out the back window into the dark before he could argue further. What followed was the longest quarter hour of her life, crouched behind the woodpile in the bitter night air, listening to the outlaws call out for Emmett Cross by name at the front door, listening to Emmett's voice, steadier than she'd expected, steadier than his weakened body had any right to produce, answering them with enough calm authority to hold their attention at the threshold while she circled wide around the well, her breath fogging in the cold, her hands steady on the shotgun despite the hammering of her heart. She came up behind the nearest man, just as he raised his pistol toward the door where Emmett stood framed in lamplight, rifle leveled, refusing to back down though his wounded shoulder must have screamed with the effort of holding it. Delia did not hesitate. She fired a warning blast into the dirt at the outlaw's feet that sent him stumbling backward with a shout of alarm, and in the chaos that followed, horses spooking, men shouting, the whole careful plan of a quiet ambush collapsing into confusion. Emmett got a clean shot off that caught the second man in the leg, and the third, seeing his companions down and a woman he could not locate firing from the darkness with unnerving precision, turned his horse and fled into the night rather than press his luck further. It was over almost as quickly as it began, the wounded outlaw groaning in the dirt, his companion nursing a shoulder full of buckshot, both them disarmed and bound with harness leather by the time Delia had reloaded and circled back to the cabin. Her hands finally beginning to shake now that the danger had passed. Emmett met her at the door, ashen with pain and effort, but upright, alive, and pulled her into his good arm the moment she came within reach. "You could have been killed," he said into her hair, his voice rough. "Circling out there alone and dark, against armed men, for my sake," Italia said, her own voice unsteady now that there was finally room to feel the fear she'd set aside. "I've lived alone on this range 6 years, Emmett Cross. I know how to survive on it a great deal better than the town of Rincon ever gave me credit for. I've never doubted what you're capable of," he said. "Not for one moment. I only wish I'd been the kind of man 7 years ago who deserved to stand beside you while you proved it." The marshal rode out from Rincon the next morning to collect the 2 wounded outlaws, a grizzled, unhurried man, Tice Barlow, who had heard a fair share of tall tales in his years wearing a badge and did not trouble to hide his admiration once Emmett had finished recounting, plainly and without embellishment, exactly how the night had unfolded. A woman who circles a war party in the dark with nothing but a shotgun and her own good sense, Barlow said, tipping his hat toward Delia where she stood on the porch. is a woman this county owes a considerable debt to. I'll see it's known proper, ma'am, that Rincon's marshal thinks so. Word of the whole affair spread through the county within the week. Not the old scandal of a broken courtship and a laundress's disgraced daughter, but a new story entirely. Of a healer woman who had saved a dying man's life with no obligation to do so, and then saved it a second time with a shotgun and a steadier nerve than any lawman in the territory. Rincon's opinion of Delia Marsh, so carelessly ruined 7 years past by a young man's cruel words, mended itself a good deal faster than her wound-bound patient did. Banker's wife, who had once refused her mother's laundry service, sent a basket of preserves to the cabin with an apology folded inside it. The very church social hall where Emmett had humiliated her stood ready, come spring, to host an entirely different gathering. "I mean to ask your forgiveness properly this time," Emmett told her, the morning his strength had finally returned enough to ride into Rincon under his own power, "and I mean to ask for your hand alongside it. If you'll allow a coward 7 years, reform the chance to prove himself worthy of asking." "You're not a coward anymore," Delia said. "A coward doesn't stand in a doorway with a wounded shoulder and hold a line for a woman he has no right to expect anything from." "Then say yes," Emmett said, "and let me spend whatever years I've got left proving I finally understood what I nearly threw away." Delia Marsh, who had built an entire life out of the wreckage of one careless spring, who had learned to heal because the town would not let be anything softer, looked at the man before her, humbled, honest, a lie only because her own hands had refused to let the old cruelty win, and found that the wound she had carried 7 long years had finally, quietly, closed over into something that no longer ached at all. "Yes," she said. "On one condition, Emmett Cross, that you never again mistake my kindness for something a man is owed. I gave it to you freely, the same as I'd give it to any soul I found dying in the dirt. What you do with a second chance is entirely up to you." "Then I intend to spend the rest of my life earning it," Emmett said, and kissed her there on the porch of the cabin where she had nursed him back from the edge of death not once, but twice, the same porch he had once been too much of a coward to ever approach, and, at last, the courage he should have found 7 years before. They were married that spring in the very churchyard, where he had once shamed her before the whole of Rincon, and this time it was Emmett who stood before the gathered town and spoke plainly, without a single careless word, of the debt he owed a laundress's daughter who had grown into the finest and steadiest soul the county had ever known. Delia's cabinet of herbs came with her to his ranch house, every jar carefully labeled and carried by wagon, and in the years that followed her healing skill became as well regarded across the county as her courage already was, sought after by families who had once turned their custom away from mother's door without a second thought. She never did forget the 7 years of quiet disgrace that had shaped her into the woman capable of saving Emmett Cross's life twice over, but she found, in the end, that she no longer carried them as a wound at all, only as the long, hard road that had led her at last to a love worth every mile of it.